Do we have anyone who's ready, even if your presentation is on Friday? If you think you are ready and you can present now. Anybody? Okay. All right. Sawa. Thank you so much. Okay. All right. So we have then the additions we want.
Okay, good afternoon. I think we had a number of very good papers presented. We had 5 papers, and they actually traversed a large subject area, from the right to development to the paper on the role of the church, to the paper on the role of political parties in promoting political democracy, and then the duty of care, and then the paper on also political parties, but with a different spin. So I'd just like very briefly to talk about some of these issues and just raise a number of issues. First, to note that I am impressed by the coverage of the papers, because we are not just looking at the law says. We actually are having people who are looking at the nuances and the application of law in context. So on the right to development, I think it's very important to begin talking about the right to development as a human right. And those of you who followed this year in July, the United Nations General Assembly actually adopted a resolution on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And within that, you have the socioeconomic rights that Nelias was talking about. Of course, we've had a declaration on the right to development from 1986, and the whole question of why do we need to have a right to development? And one has to look at the genesis of that as the right of states. If we are talking about the right to development as the right of states, remember in the post-colonial era, when our governments were talking about the right to develop and the importance for them to use their resources to develop. So I think that they're now talking about the right to development as a right of people is really a new thing. And increasingly we have the right to development for states and that of people being brought together. If you look at discussions that are going on now about damage for climate change, it brings in this right to development, both as a right of states, but also as a right of individual. And what I'm saying is that when you talk about the right to development, and you're talking about rights holders and duty bearers, you need also to begin to look at how the landscape has changed. It is not just states and individuals. We now have very strong non-state actors. We also have private sector. And all these can be either, or they can actually be on duty bearer. And in fact, when the reason I was talking about the General Assembly resolution is that in that particular resolution, they talk about the need for non-state actors and private sector to take on the responsibility to protect this right to development. The other thing that I thought needs to come out, even as we talk about the right to development, and as a person who works in the area of the environment, I'd be remiss if I talked about the right to environment without also talking about the planetary boundaries. because human beings think that they can develop by taking and taking and taking, and that there are no limits. So we need to begin to think about the emerging issues as we look at a human right which emphasizes rights of humans, or Anthropocene, as opposed to also rights of nature to regenerate, the ecocentric. Then the other thing I thought was, when you talk about development, we have had discussions, a national and robust discussion on this issue after the post-election violence in 2007, 2008. If you look at the National Dialogue and Reconciliation Report, it actually canvasses issues that are development-centric, and actually because in the abstract you also talked about peace, it also talks about durable peace. So that would be useful. Then the paper by Kagema on the role of the church in promoting gender inclusivity and justice. I think the church, when we talk about the church, I have a very critical mind, so you will excuse me. Because when we talk about church, many times we only think about the Abrahamic religions. So we're thinking about the established formal churches. And maybe because of being so formalistic and not looking at where people live and the belief systems and value and ethic systems they have at that level, we are living out a whole body of behavior. And maybe that's why people go to church and do church as a formal institution, but it doesn't touch who they are, because it is there and they are here. Isn't there people who say, I will leave God on the fence and I will now handle you? So that I think is something we should think about. And whilst I see the role that the church can play, I think it would be good to also be a little nuanced about the role of the church in promoting the exclusion of women. Because it's not, it can play a positive role, but it is a double-edged sword. And because it is a belief system, there is a sense in which what is said in church, people don't question. So how be it that churches are mainly women, but even the idea of having women as leaders in churches is still contested. So how can they go and tell political parties have women when looking at themselves, they don't have women? So I think it's important to be a little nuanced. And it reminds me, PLO, of the WACO draft in 2005. You know, the WACO draft, I know that some of you don't know the WACO draft, I'm sorry, but you need to read constitutional history. The WACO draft was a draft of the Constitution that had very interesting proposals. One was religious courts. And none of us wanted to imagine, because you're wondering, you're taken to a religious court as a woman. Do you even have standing? Can you go before that court? So I think those are things that we need to think about, and also where we're coming from. Then there was the paper on political parties and their role. And I think Francis and Purity made a very clear case for the role that political parties play. And I think this has been a running theme in the last 2 days, that if we had stronger political parties, we probably wouldn't have as many problems as we have. And in fact, even in this morning's papers, there were people who were still talking about political parties. And the paper by Macharia and, you have to remind me your name, Mulwa. It is not that you are not important, Chalo, not Mulwa, Chalo and Macharia. I think it brings in an interesting spin into the discussion on political parties, because it is looking at what Maxwell Miyawa was talking about this morning, extra-constitutional measures, the way you hoist certain considerations above what is required in the law, and that actually makes law redundant. And in essence, when they talk about the design and intent, maybe people know, okay, that is the law, let the law remain there, as we will operate in this extra legal space, which we have designed to favor us. And I think it was an interesting discussion on the institutional efficiency, it being like a business that people use to sort of entrench themselves. The whole question of pro-constitutional environment reminds me again, PLO, of Kodho Gendo's age-old paper on constitutions without constitutionalism. That our countries love to have constitutional documents, but they really don't care about following through with the spirit that constitutions demand of them. So I found that the social, political discussion very interesting, because that's what's going to make us begin to question our political parties and look at where they go. I really like the duty of care. You know, at first when I had seen the title without reading the abstract, I thought that what Moses was suggesting is that there should be catharsis for IEBC officials. I mean, and of course yesterday, having listened to the experience that people have, but I think Moses makes a very interesting case of those who we endow with those important duties. And it is process, not event. What should we expect of them? Because, you know, when you think about it, all these Kenyans queuing in the cold, having their fingers colored with ink that stays with them for many days, and you know, for many people that can also be traumatizing after your candidate has lost and you still have the ink on your, because in essence, people go to vote because they expect that you trust, you know. It is almost a breach of a trust that people have put on these institutions. And I really would, I'm looking forward to reading that paper. And I do hope, as Honorable Ochieng asked yesterday, that we would be taking these things forward. Because you see, what has now happened in the Kenyan space is accept and move on. But you know, the duty of care, how do you ensure, and I think it was Wamwara who was showing us the going down figures of people who turn up to vote. So if you look at those who voted for one side and the ones who voted for the other side and the ones who were registered and didn't vote, then you can see that this is something that we should be paying attention to. So with those many remarks, I also liked, I think it's the Masharia and Chalo, who talked about people having political parties as insurance. And you know, I'll tell you, political parties are insurance. If Honorable Ngilu and Honorable Karua did not have their parties, they would never have been on the ballot box for president, for governor. And you know, having your own party gives you an assurance that you will get there. But there is also the larger than party individuals. That, oh, when you talk about ODM, when you talk about NAC, when you talk about WIPA. So in fact, these individuals begin to become the party. And that, I think, is problematic for a democracy. And we see it coming up now when you have these consociational contraptions. You bring in, you even forget there was TNA, was it URP, then Jubilee, and UDA, you forget. But people go to people with, it's almost deceit. Because they just come together in the wee hours and say, now we are Kenya Kwanza, now we are Azimio. And Kenyans follow through. And that's why duty of care is important, because after people are defeated, they are very traumatized. Okay, now I'd like to welcome questions. A number, I'll take one. Please put up your hands, because we are not, it's not like. So this place, all the three questions have come from here. We will have the fourth one from there. So we can take those, unless there is one around here. Ogendi, you don't have any question? Okay, so we will have those. Let's start.
Thank you. I have two very short questions. My first question is to Nelias. Right to development and peace. It was an interesting discussion. You took us through the journey of the dalliance between the executive and the judiciary from pre-independent Kenya 1952, where the governor, Sir Evelyn Berry, recalled a judge from retirement to prosecute the Kapenguria 6, and that judge was rewarded. Through the Moi era, where you termed the judiciary as a tool of executive, through the Kibaki area, where you termed the judiciary as a handmaid of the executive. Then in 2017, after the Maraga ruling, the executive called the judiciary Wakora. The flip side of it is that public confidence in Kenya was increased. Then in 2022 elections, the dalliance between the executive and the judiciary has caused the judiciary to be moved from the office of the president. There is a fully fledged judiciary fund. So my question here is, Nelias, personally, how can we divorce? Because I remember, I think it was last week, where one opposition MP said, and I quote, "The executive has gone to bed with the judiciary." I don't know how many of you read that. My question is, how can we divorce the executive from the judiciary for the purpose of development, peace, and especially during elections? My second question to Peterson. Normally, before elections, we see hordes of candidates flocking to churches. They flock to churches to ask for votes from the congregants or from the congregation. This has been happening in Kenya, especially before elections and during the electioneering period. As a CRE teacher, Professor Kameri, I like your assertion about religion. I don't know if you looked at it from the moral side of it or from the spiritual side of it, but the question I want to put to Peterson is Is it right or is it wrong to use the church as a campaign tool? Thank you.
You just move to the next person, and please, there are questions here. They are there.
Okay, yes, mine would just be a comment to Joseph and Sam. Of course, we had this discussion over lunch. Maybe they could look at the role of governance structures that exists in these political parties, because most of the amendments that have been occurring on the Political Parties Act have been focused on the governance structures, which have kind of helped reduce the many problems that we've oftenly faced with these political parties. And this can be evidenced from the number of disputes that have been brought forward to the tribunal. Maybe I speak of this having been a member of the tribunal, because I know those governance structures have greatly taken political parties forward. There's been a great move in terms of, despite me hearing people say they're still not so democratic, but there's been a great move, and it would be important if you perhaps have a look at these governance structures that have been introduced by the Act, and most parties have factored them in as you do your paper. Yeah, that would be it.
Thank you. Dr. Aura has a comment.
Thank you, the presenters and the Prof. Now, my comment is on the church. Sometimes back, I used to be a very, very good Christian. Not that I'm a bad one now, but don't laugh. I'm sure all of us have passed through that stage one way or the other. There is a way in which you said the church is working very closely with the political parties, some other people, to bring women on board. And I just want to I want you to maybe try and really reinterrogate, not interrogate, but reinterrogate the church. Because this is the church, I'll come today. You want me to sit somewhere because I'm attached to someone. The moment I'm not attached to that person, you start blacklisting me. And yet, you want a church that is inclusive. And if, for instance, you keep saying, you know, men at the head. And so I don't know where the legs, or I don't know where we belong to. But okay, even if you're the head, sometimes I say we are the neck. So without the neck, the head can't stand. So how are you going to convince that same church that is very, you know, has a lot of contradictions in its preaching, to convince the political class to get women into leadership? Because the church itself is a problem. As much as now you can tell, you know, you preach water, but you drink wine, yeah? So, and especially these verses, like sometimes you misinterpret them a lot. For husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. So, church submits to Christ, and then wives must submit to husbands in everything. So when you say everything, it means when I'm going for a political position, I have to negotiate with this person because he's the head. How do we get around that? Because maybe this is the problem why women do not want to come out to participate in politics, because there's a hurdle right in front of our nose. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Let me say that I listened to the presenters in the, I can say in the early afternoon or towards the noon, and they had wonderful presentations. And I'll begin with Miss Nelius Njuguna, I think that's your name. And you were talking about the role of judiciary, and you talked about peace and development. And there's no peace without development. There's no development without peace. I have a question for you. For example, one of the reasons why our elections are highly contested is because the person who becomes president has a greater role to play or to decide on which region receives a greater share of our cake, the budget. And now, for example, as we are normally told, accept and move on, you have someone or a certain region that is always having leaders, and certain regions don't have presidents. And do we have development in these regions? You know what I'm talking about. Like, for example, look at the Luo Nyanza region, where there have been no presidents, and we've been having presidents either central or the Rift Valley. And then they get the greater cake, and then the Nyanza people miss the cake. And then where is the development? There is peace, but there's no development. Anyway, next question I'd like to ask Dr. Hayundi and my brother Macharia. You've spoken well about political parties. In fact, I took one of your quotes that weak political parties in Kenya are by design and by intention. I took your quote and you spoke very well. My question is, you spoke very well about the problems we have in our political parties, but what solution now going forward? What is the solution? And then my brother, the teacher, thank you so much for coming and for being confident. You spoke so well. My question is about the church. In this election, the church has played a big role in the election, as we have observed, especially the evangelical church. And my question is, but what it appears is the church was not really a player, but it was a tool of the politicians. And I believe that going forward, the church can be an alternative of the tribe in advancing the interests of the people. Instead of becoming a tool of a politician, you can bargain and negotiate with the politician to support him in return for something, maybe some form of development as an alternative of the tribe. Thank you so much anyway.
Let's have Ogendi. This is the only round I'll take. We will have Wamwara, we will have Betty, and we will have Seth.
Yes.
Sorry, it was off. Now, I just wanted to know, why did you think that a statutory duty of care is the standard which we should go by, considering that obviously all public institutions owe a duty of care in one way or the other, because there's a fiduciary relationship between the government and the people. Considering that we can go for constitutional duty of care, is there a particular reason why statutory is much more preferred than the constitutional duty of care?
I'm next. Okay. I have two issues I want to, just a comments. One, I wish, Moses, I wish IEBC were here to listen to you, particularly the spokesperson yesterday. And I agree with you. They owe us something. At least something, and number one. Number two, on Mwalimu, I think the church as even when you talk about gender and why we are hard up on only two genders is because the Bible has declared it, and therefore we can never have a third gender, you know. And in the beginning, God created man and women, created he, them, male and female, and therefore then I think there's so much that the church can learn on gender issues, then there are lessons it can offer. That's what I think. And I think you could also think towards those. I question some of those practices, including they are very reluctant to how we want to apply the creed, is it the 70 AD creed to the 21st century realities. So I just ask that you have a very critical approach to this, including questioning some of the Christian religious, not just Christian, but Christian, the Abrahamic approach to gender. Thank you.
So he said some of the things, but for me, perhaps I'd ask who or what is the church, given the different forms that we see, whether it's individual or a grouping, who is this or what is this institution that we are calling a church, and what is it that makes it a church? Is there something that holds them together? Especially because you're saying that they are supposed to be the moral barometer, then the question is it just an external responsibility and not internal? If in 2013, there was a report that was done at the time when they were evaluating the malpractices. And the church went in and put people in there to do their own evaluation. And they came out with a rather interesting report, akin to the one that was being argued with one of the political parties. But when they came out with their report, they took it and put it in the drawer, because they just didn't want to rock the boat. By the way, this is information that was being shared with us 3 years later, after people had died as a result of the fact that they kept quiet about the findings. When we were electing a new IEBC board, they were represented in there, despite some of the strange characters that were presented as members. They were part and parcel of giving us this person who was apparently rumored to be number 9 out of number 9. They had no problem with that, none whatsoever. As recent as in Bomas, in the midst of all this fury and everything, you'd imagine that we'd say, we need to calm down, we need to sit, we need to try and see how we can bring this warring, partners in, the Serena Four, and I don't know who the others were called, and they didn't. And so I struggle. Perhaps one of the things we should ask ourselves is, when you're asking the questions about the church, is to be able to interrogate the actions that they have practiced in relation to abusing the mandate that citizens has given them. And I say that when I have a picture of these people with their hands on top of somebody saying how God should punish every single person who had been affected by post-election violence, even as they were claiming for some form of justice and reparation. So, and then when you consider that they've also taken to a tribal alliance or leaning, and we see that even in the structure when it comes to leadership. Is this an institution that we actually want to start asking ourselves, that we want to give this huge responsibility to be the one that guides us when, like I said, it is an institution that is broken and has never healed. And how do we expect them to then come and heal the same nation that's broken?
Yes, just picking up from where Madam Betty has left. Mwalimu, even after you've explained to us your definition of what a church is, I would also like you to enlighten us on the double standards that what you will define as the church has been having. Because on the one hand, they carry the Bible, swear and state you're not supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do this. On the other hand, every Sunday, there's this politics that the church does each and every Sunday. And it became more eminent from, I think in 2017, heading into 2022. Previously, we had the church being the custodian of our moral values, and the church would stand firmly against the ills and maladies that were in the society. But the church that we see today is a politicized church. It is a church where people get to the podium and rather than preach the word of God and nourish the souls of people, it's insults in one sermon, the other they're calling someone a different name. So I'd really want you to tell us how the church is something that we can look up to, and how the church can gain the moral standing that it previously had and guide the people. And to my friend who spoke about the duty of care, Mushiri, I agree that in one way or the other, this electoral body, the IBC, it owes us a duty of care. But if we look at the petition that was filed, the 2022 petition, there were prayers, and some of the prayers were directed at individuals at the IBC. There was some against the Chebukati and his team. But when the Supreme Court delivered its ruling, we found they just gave recommendations. And as we know, recommendations in Kenya, if court orders cannot be obeyed, how sure are we that recommendations can even be things that can be followed? So I'd really like you to give us something tangible that we can say, okay, fine. If these and these are done, then we are going to make sure that that duty of care is indeed dispensed with. And also, you shouldn't be giving a lecture. I'm not giving a lecture. You know. and finally, Joseph and Kialo, I also, I agree, this is just a comment, I agree with where you say that the political parties are insurance tools. There are things that are used by people to bargain. Because if you look at even 2022, you find people from Coast come with a certain political party, people from Western come with a certain political party. Is it that the political parties do not have structures that, there was that speaker who talked about Tanzania and the women, representation of women. How can we put our political parties in such a manner that rather than having 81 political parties as of January, as was said, we have fewer political parties, but we ensure that representation within those parties meet the constitutional threshold? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have Wahoo online, and then PLO, and we have one more question. But please be quick so that we can go to the next. Wahoo online, can you hear us? Wahoo, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you well and clear.
Okay, so my question goes to the good fellow that presented on the paper on the role of the church in ensuring gender inclusivity. I'm not sure if I got that. I joined the meeting halfway. So I'm struggling to understand how mutual dominion can exist or coexist together with gender-based hierarchy. When he said that the church should use biblical standards to ensure that there is gender inclusivity, because the Bible itself is characterized with the rule of fathers. That's what takes preeminence when we talk about leadership in the biblical concept. So I would want to know how he thinks, or what is the role of a woman in such a patriarchal system. Is she merely a loyal or suitable assistant to a man? Or what role does a woman play really? Because my understanding of the whole idea of the church and gender is that its application, the application of the concepts of the Bible and its realities is just to affirm that one being, that is the woman, is created with the help of the other human being who is a man. So the one who receives such help has a certain authority over the one who is the helper. So how is a woman going to exercise their dominion? Is it an equal sharing of the dominion? Because that is what gender equality is all about. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to help, because there are too many questions going to. I think let us, as we expect him to answer, make a distinction between the clergy and the church. Let's make that a distinction. We are the church, if you are Christian. And in this regard, I want all of us to read Henry Okulu's book, Church and Politics, and also to read Desmond Pilow's book, God is Not a Christian. So I think let's be fair to the gentleman because he's not a clergy. And let us also look at the origin of the word church, ecclesia. The Greek word ecclesia, the called out ones. And a kurion, from which the word church comes, which is the dedicated ones. So we are the ones who are dedicated. So let's be fair to you. That's what I want, because I see there were too many barbs against you. Thank you very much.
Okay. You have a microphone. I will hold it. I'll hold it. No. Please, you must, you know the rule of fathers.
Thank you. PLO has said something which has made me think about what I was going to ask. However, just allow me to ask this. The church, if you remember in 2010, the church advised its followers to vote against the Constitution, majorly because of Article 20, the clergy. The clergy has its following. You know, if you look at the clergy, they have their following and they are advising their members because of Article 26, which talks of right to life. However, their followers did something else. So, you see, that says something about the direction the people were being given. In 2022, again, I think when the BBI came up, a group of the clergy and its followers, and then another group, they were pulling different yes, no, yes, no. Now, there's also this discussion going on about the cash that is being given to the clergy or the church by certain politicians with questionable character. Then what is our perception? What are we supposed to interpret on the leadership that the church is having? Now, who are these members of the church? It is still us again. And then we practice what Professor Mbote has said. On one side, we are practicing the politics, and then when we go to church, we are different people, so we are leaving God on the fence when it suits us. You'll remember during this pandemic, a section of the church leaders again said, do not take these vaccines because it is not good, it is not Christian enough or religious enough for us to take it. So I feel the church really needs to work with its membership, or the leadership of the church really needs to look at what it is they are saying out there and what they are practicing, because it's creating confusion on the way to go.
I think that the people up here have answers to all your questions. So I'll give them all, I'll start with Peter. You have 1 minute because we are the ecclesia. So just know it is the clergy and the ecclesia. And all of us are followers. Even if we go to the mosque, we are part of the body that follows. So.
Wow, it's a lot of questions, but I'll attempt.
You know you don't have to answer all the questions. All you have to, we want you to give us your pin drop nugget of wisdom. Because from what has been talked about here, it means all of us are questioning. So you won't be able to answer all of us. We will take you up again, and I think Professor PLO has said that those questions should be coming to all of us. Yeah.
Well, thank you. First, I'm happy because that's a topic that has generated a lot of issues and hot discussions. Now, one, the issue of definition of the church. One of the challenges that we have been having is the issue of distinguishing the church and the society. Now, there is the assumption that when the church has been taken or defined based on leaders, Professor have helped me to distinguish that we are part of the church. So however, the definition of the church is the issue of leadership. So when a leader of the church rises, then what he or she says is taken as a basic truth. So however, that may not be the standing of the church, we as the church. However, when we talk, so as the body of Christ, that's maybe the immediate definition of the church, how we are supposed to follow. That is those who practices. That is the real definition of the church is the discipleship and followers of the moral conduct of the Bible and what it teaches. So if those people who read, who are supposed to define, to give the clear definition, if we follow what is expected, then that's the truth church. However, now the definition of the church is infinite, based on the way you understand or approach it. Now, I'll look at 3 questions. One is it good to use church as a campaign tool? One, to me, it's no, because politicians, as we know it, they come with their own honey-coated language. However, what they give or they portray outside there, it's not what they practice. It's not what is intended. So, when they come to campaign or they use the church as a tool, then they are kind of painting a negative image on what the consumers of the word or the consumers of the teachings are expected to follow. So they tend to redefine the positive aspect in the church. So to me, it's not good. Now the question of there was the question of how can the church come out? That is a tend to bring out the positiveness, so that because it has been seen as it has been promoting the negative or retrogressive gender issues. One, to me, one of the problem is that has been a historical problem. For those who are the students of church history, you know how traditionally the church, since that is a 2nd, 3rd century, up to 10th century, there has been a lot of councils that has been promoted. Now, one of the councils I was researching, I found there's a council of Trent that argued that Eve was responsible in making Abraham to sin. Adam to sin when he ate the fruit, the forbidden fruit. So such kind of traditions, they have been promoting negative approach. They have been taken negatively. However, to me, it's high time that the church, or a kind of that is, we come up with the correct that is, if I may call it, hermeneutics that will tend to redefine and interpret properly, because the problem is a misinterpretation of the Bible. You find that the culture of the Bible is totally different with the culture that we live today. So the problem has been for those church or leaders who have been misinterpreting the issue of gender and praise of women, is only that they don't understand or distinguish between the culture of the Bible and the culture of today. So if we live by 21st century changes and understanding, I think we shall be good to go. Then, what can the church do in the question of moral decay? In that case, the issue of church as a broken institution. So to me, I think there is need for an overhaul of the leaders, because the problem is that most of the church, today we have very many churches that are cropping in individually. Somebody comes up and starts a church, and he or she dictates his or her own directions that the members are to go. So if we have a proper that is judging on, that is rules, and that is rules and laws that should be followed for such kind of a misinterpretation. To avoid them, I think we can be good to go. So anyway, I have, it's an issue that I'll keep on thinking of it. Thank God you have started my thinking of line of thinking. It's positive, I take it positive, and so thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Nelias. I noticed that there is no gender balance here. So Nelias, you have the floor.
Thank you. There was a question on how can we divorce the judiciary from the executive for purpose of peace and development. In my opinion, the doctrine of separation of powers, where it's assumed that the judiciary should be independent, sometimes it's just theoretical, and in practice, what happens is that because the president is the one who is appointing these judges, like previously when President Uhuru Kenyatta refused to appoint a few judges for his own reasons, even though they had passed the interviews, you see if they still have to be appointed by the executive sometimes, there is still some bias. But in my opinion, how that can be dealt with is now for the judicial officers for themselves to see that they owe a duty of care. As his paper says, even the judicial officers have a duty of care to all citizens to make the best decisions in the best interest of the country, because Kenya is bigger than just one person. And also, it's also upon the public. For instance, when the president did not appoint judges, there was uproar. I think there's even someone who filed a case. So all these are tools that can ensure judicial independence. And also court orders. Maybe we need to develop a mechanism to ensure that the government obeys court orders, because right now, as it is, you'll find that the court renders a very good judgment, yet the enforcement is the issue. So that also calls for goodwill on the executive to enforce decisions. There was also a question on development in places where they voted against the president at that time. Pre-2010 constitution, you could see that development was taking place in those places where the president comes from. So you'll find roads are being constructed, hospitals, schools. But after 2010, due to devolution, I think every county gets its own allocation of funds. And if counties can utilize those funds or even get their own income-generating activities, because they have that power, they will have funds to develop their own county. And also, we need a stronger opposition. I think we need to implement what Dr. Wamwara was saying. What happens to these 50-1 people who did not vote in the president? We need to rethink that system. That's something I think might work so that it's equal. Everyone gets an equal share of the cake. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Nelias. Let's hear from Moses.
Thank you, Prof. I had two questions and a comment. Dr. Wamwara, thank you for the comment, and it's noted. Asante sana. What went through my mind when I thought about why a duty of care, or this standard of the duty of care? When you interrogate the history of the development of this standard of duty of care, one has to also ask the same question. What were the judges, what was Lord Atkins thinking about when he developed in common law the standard of the duty of care using the fiduciary relationship in Donahue versus Stevenson? And why is it then that there have been permutations of this standard in jurisdictions such as Australia and South Africa, which are now borrowing this concept in areas that are outside the fiduciary scope? actually in climate change, where the government in Australia has actually been held liable under a novel duty of care for omissions to take actions to reduce climate change in Australia. And I had that discussion with Daktari Avalanche, that indeed there is even a lawsuit that has been filed in Kenya, which seeks to hold the government responsible in Kenya for climate change omissions. But now one realizes that the fiduciary relationship alone is not enough. The Constitution, on one hand, gives us principles, and then we have the legal framework under the Elections Act and the regulations thereunder. But one court, one Supreme Court, interprets it differently from another. You have the 2013 judgment, where, coincidentally, we expected the court to take the position that was taken in 2017, but it was in reverse. And then we had the decision this year, in this year's presidential election petition, which has in some circles been described as lethargic jurisprudence. Lethargic jurisprudence. Anyway, consider the processes that led towards the declaration of the results. In preparation for this paper, I had an opportunity to talk to one of the senior counsel who was an active litigant in the just concluded 2022 petition. And when I asked this question, sir, do you think a duty of care should be, a standard can be recommended against the IEBC? On a light-hearted note, he posed this question: don't you think a duty of care also means a duty not to care? What he meant was this, that if you consider the actions of the chair, Webukati, after the declaration by the after the announcement, the press announcement by the 4 commissioners, the question featured in court in the 2022 decision. I don't know if you've interacted with that decision, where one of the questions that was being asked is, who is the commission in the context of electoral processes? Who is the commission? And interestingly, the court answered that this way. When it comes to all the processes leading up to the actual election, including administration of the election itself, the commission is the commission, which means the commissioners plus the secretariat. But when it comes to tallying and verification of the results, the final results, the commission means the commissioners only. When it comes to the declaration of the final result, who is the commission? The chairperson. 3 definitions for the same commission. As you think about that, think about this. What does the country risk by not adopting this or embracing this duty of care? Well, pre-2010 constitutional chaos in election processes, perhaps a very pedantic approach to constitutional and electoral laws as a box-ticking exercise. Look, I understand, we cannot legislate everything. And so I would like to ask you, my colleagues and seniors here, don't you think that in view of our history, our elections history, and our body of cases in this country, that if we had an overarching legal policy that provides a theoretical, from a legal basis, a theoretical approach, that this would canvass the body and spirit of the existing constitutional and statutory requirements in a consistent manner that allows the judiciary and all actors in the democratic space the ability to uphold constitutional principles on every aspect of the electoral processes. This is a duty of care. So yes, I do agree, sir, that the only thing I would add is this is our theory of legal accountability under very unique and specialized circumstances. Thank you so much.
But why is statutory, not constitutional? Your title is very deliberate.
Yes.
Why is statutory and not constitutional duty of care?
I thought, well, can I respond to this?
Yes, you may.
Okay, thank you so much. there are different standards that apply to a constitutional duty of care, but it's not really constitutional, it's a statutory duty of care and a novel duty of care. In the presentation, that is what I alluded to in the Caparo test, because it laid the framework under a three-tier test. What I could not have gone through in detail in the presentation, but which is there in the paper, against which now public authorities operating as an exception to the general legal policy and rule then can now apply a legal and a standard of duty of care under novel circumstances. Now that three test will probably answer that situation. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now we'll hear from Macharia and Chalo. How do you want to share that? So we hear from Chalo first because he was second.
Right, that's actually not the reason, but the reason is because I'll address the question on what recommendations would make, then Macharia will address the second question. So thank you very much for the comment. I think initially this was intended to be a positive paper, simply diagnosing the problem, but with your comment we see the need to go a step further and make specific recommendations other than just saying that this is not the best strategy and now say what's the best strategy. So threading something from what we already had, we think that it would be important to first point out that since the problem is not in the law, it may not be strategic to think of amending the law because we've already identified the laws that are there and they seem to be quite robust. I mean, constitutional and statutory. The framework is quite good. So first of all, retaining that framework would be a good thing because it serves an educational function, because those constitutional principles that we have are aspirational, and therefore when we have them, hopefully they may influence the political culture that we'll have in a few years. But to be able to reform political culture, which may take a long time, we think that political processes would need to be taken away from the political elite because that's the current situation. To take away these processes from the political elite would mean involving the public so that reforms may be spearheaded for, and political parties won't be the ones to spearhead for these reforms because already they are the beneficiaries of weak parties. However, we think that there is a prospect to be creative and come up with strategies that make more sense, like involving civil society organizations, progressive politicians even, and when you think about progressive politicians, law schools produce progressive lawyers or aim to produce progressive lawyers for the courtroom to litigate, to be judges. But there is very little attention to producing progressive, pro-constitutional, non-judicial actors, like party leaders and MPs and the like. So we think law schools have a role to play, civil society has a role to play, as well as other influential actors, but that's something that we'll need to think about further. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll try and address a question from Seth. Is it that political parties do not have structures? I think they do. And our argument is that political parties do not have, they exist. And there's a framework within which they exist. If it's a party leader, you have an election management board for purposes of nomination and all that. We have them. Our argument is that the way they are designed, or the people you fill in, and I think what Prof was saying, we have a beneficially, I think whenever you want to analyze a certain non-legal or even legal that is laced with socio-political issues, you need to pick the premise and then ask yourself who are the beneficiaries in this premise and who are the likely losers. Once you're able to get that, then you tilt the argument and ask yourself, who are the likely losers and who are the likely beneficiaries. If you do that, then you are able to see the structure as it exists seems to be geared toward a certain direction. And then you ask yourself, so what benefits come out of it? So if we were to say that we have party structures, for instance, I think the member from the political parties tribunal might have, for instance, the dispute resolution, requirement within the party. Alfred Kettel would be very mad to hear that, he had, for instance, allegedly won, but declared differently. So the argument is that structures are there, but the way they are conceptualized and organized are organized in a way that weakens the party as it should exist, and there are beneficiaries in that context. So to address that, we need to demystify and say, okay, this is what the law says, but this is how parties actually operate. And then we focus our energy not on law, but start addressing the issues. And I could give an example. A strong party would not be allowed to be quote unquote owned by an individual. Okay? But a weak party are owned, and the institutional structure are such that a party leader, for instance, is almost untamed. Okay? So this is important, but the ownership is important for purposes of sustaining a weak party that then benefits, for instance, the party leader, because if he can he can take the direction of the party, then he is able to either reward, or punish. Lack of a clear-cut institutionalized ideology maybe obviously contributes to a weak party, but it does two things. Post-elections, it allows easier movement of people from one party to the other, and the question one keeps asking, if truly you are a member of a certain political party because of an ideology, it can't change within overnight after an election. So failure to have a serious ideological approach in a party in itself creates people to go in a certain room and negotiate. I can actually now join you. But it would be difficult if you had serious ideological differences or identities for parties. So I think we approach it from there, but yeah, I hope I've answered.
So thank you all very much. I had hoped that I would use less time, but I think this was a very useful deliberation, and thank you all. And I'd just also like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists for their presentations. Thank you.
All right. Another round of applause to Professor and team. Asanteni sana. And right, so I'm going to invite Daktari to lead us in the last session of presentation of papers. But so we have the following presenters, and the way I call your name is also the order in which you will follow, right? The first one will be Oscar Mahaso. Oscar, where are you? Oscar? Oscar. So then we skip. Looks like Oscar is not there, so we move on to John Jakinda and Naska Mutinda. So yours will be the first one then. And then we will have Ndindi Nganga and Paul Ogendi. Then the last one will be Dr. Samuel Ongwen Okuro. Ndindi Nganga, how are you? We are very sorry that your paper is titled Invisible Children, and somehow your content is also very invisible in the book of abstracts. No, it's the title is invisible anyway. So, okay, John Jakinda, take it away. Just a minute.
10 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. The title of my paper is The Challenge of Electoral Malpractice as an Albatross in the Kenyan Quest for Democratic Electoral Governance. First of all, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the organizers of this conference, including the UNDP and the Follap family as a general. We don't take it for granted. In light of that, I've seen my paper has been, there are some parts that have been elaborated well by the previous presenters of, especially in the morning, so I'll make it as short as possible. Okay, I'll then proceed to my first submissions. Okay, the challenge of electoral malpractice in Kenya, it has been a challenge from not only in this century, but it dates back to the 1957, where there was manipulations of the rules that governed the elections in this country. In that particular time, the colonial government controlled the electoral process by manipulating the voters and using the concept of voter disenfranchisement. Okay. During that time, there was voter disfranchisement among the Mau Mau who were prevented from voting because it was a time where the colonial government was still in place. Now, in light of that, in 1963, when Kenya attained its independence, this trend continued when we first had our election under the multi-party democracy, that is in 1993, yes, and there is a case of Matiba versus Moi. In this case, the incumbent government was the government of one Honorable Daniel Arap Moi. He had won the election, but Matiba had contested this election under election petition number 67 of 1993. Now, in this case, the judiciary was still under the control of the executive. And this concept was once elaborated by one scholar known as Muthomi Thiankolu, who argued that in disseminating legal sophistry, this is a situation where the executive has the control over the judiciary in regards to making decisions that favor the executive, because this was a time when still, even though we had attained our independence, but you can see even Oginga Odinga once remarked that it's not yet Uhuru in one of his famous books in the last century. Now, in this case, the Matiba was, he had brought a petition, but in that time he was suffering from a stroke. Now he donated the power of attorney to his wife, so that because he was not in that, he lacked capacity to sign the election petition, which was a requirement under the law during that time. But in this case, you can see the court dismissed the petition, citing procedural technicalities on the account that he could not have signed on the account that he didn't sign the petition in person. In light of that, we can see that even though the court used the law, it didn't use it in accordance with the dictates of which are prescribed under our constitution that is current, and even in the 1969 constitution, which, even though it didn't had a specific provision on procedural technicalities, but it was still, you could see it was still not favorable to the Matiba, who was in that period incapacitated. Now, in light of that, I'll rush towards the issues that my paper will address. The first issue is what constitutes electoral malpractice. Now, what constitutes electoral malpractice, I will use the comparative studies of Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. In light of that, the first point I like to disseminate are the forms of electoral malpractice in Kenya, the causes of electoral malpractice in Kenya, and the consequences of electoral malpractice. I'll move to first of all, the forms. Now, the forms of electoral malpractice, they manifest in various ways. First of all, they manifest in vote bribery, vote rigging, manipulation of voters, and etc. Some of the points were elaborated by my presenters before me. I'll move firstly to the comparative analysis because of time. I'll use the slide number 7, the case of Nigeria regarding the late Umar Musa of Nigeria. Now, this person was a former president of Nigeria, and he was the 13th after Olusegun Obasanjo, who was the 12th president. Now, in this case, the late Ardu was Obasanjo was in favor of the late Ardua, and in this instance, he was seen as his puppet because he didn't support his vice. His name was Atiku Abubakar. Now, in this case, you could see it was a highly contested one, but you could see that the president won over 70% of the votes garnered. This was approximately 24.6 million. And the reason why the elections observers criticized these elections, it's because that it was highly contested, and taking into the fact that Atiku Abubakar was that time the vice president, but the late Yardardua, he was only a governor in one of the states in Nigeria. And you could see he won in a very high margin. And even election observers reported that this was the worst elections they have observed in their career, and this was stated by one Max van Dekberg, who was the European Union who was assigned the duty of overseeing the elections of Nigeria. Now, in light of that, Nigeria has had a problem of election malpractice. Even they had election, I think, in 1999, 2003, 2007, and 2011. And some people argued that the preceding years, the elections kept on getting worse and worse. But in 2011, when President Goodluck Jonathan took the reins of power, people praised Nigeria because they had improved in some bit, because they had put in training, they had trained the people who are conducting the electoral officials so that they could conduct free and fair elections, but still, their electronic governance is not yet perfect. And in light of that, I'd like to move to Botswana. Is another comparative study I garnered. In Botswana, the electoral process in Botswana is one that it was the European Union, even the African Union, they were really impressed by the way Botswanans carried their election. They were peaceful, they were transparent, and they provided the benchmarks to other African countries, because even women representations were seen. You can see in Kenya, even though women are allowed to participate in elections, but in Botswana, their representation is a little bit better than in other countries. Another country that has a good election is South Africa. Now, South Africa has a dominant party called the African National Congress. Even though it's dominant, but the elections conducted, they are very, the South African Constitution has provided a situation where the process is fair by entrenching provisions that enable the electoral, that promote the rights to free and fair elections. And you can see in Article 38 and 81 of the Constitution of Kenya, there is a principle of substantial compliance, in the sense that substantial compliance states that the election process should comply to the principles which govern elections, like those enunciated in Article 81, which inter alia provide free and fair elections and fair representation of women with disabilities, and also ensuring that the third gender principle is observed and taken care of. I'll move forward to the role of the media because of time. I'll not do the role of the judiciary because I think there is a paper that resembles that topic. So I'll move to the role of the media. Still in Nigeria, in the last century, there was a musician called Fela Kuti. Fela Kuti was pioneering for electoral change in the military rule of General Obasanjo. His first rule, remember, he was president twice. So he really fought for democracy and change, but sadly, by the time he died in 1997, but in 1999, millions of Nigerians went on to vote to the same person, Olusegun Obasanjo. That means even though he promoted electoral justice, it was not enough. In Kenya, we could see there was musicians like Eric Wanaina who clamored for electoral justice during the time of case of